Hello and welcome, YouTubers. Let's take another deep breath. Oh, excellent. For those of you just joining us in, we just listened to Biscuits by Casey Musgraves, and I just love this song. You know, the main hook is mind your own biscuits and life will be gravy. And I also really liked the couple lyrics that said, I burned my own damn finger poking someone else's fire, and piss in my yard ain't gonna make yours any greener. Hey. I can't say it more directly than that, but it's so true. How we really just get wrapped up into the drama of not only our lives, but the lives of other people as well. So let's take one more deep breath. Excellent, excellent, excellent. And so today's sermon, I'm going to be introducing, for some of you it's an introduction, but the 5 layers of consciousness. And so at the beginning of my book, before you get into the 9 living peace tenets, it covers not only the 3 aspects of ego, but it also covers the 5 layers of consciousness. And the reason why this is at the beginning of the book is because it really helps us understand our awareness and whether or not we're falling into ego, we're falling into duality, we're falling into any form of judgment. And so years ago, I broke it down into just these layers that really start to make sense why you have so many different messages on the planet. For example, you have the Bible, right? But a pastor might be preaching it from one layer of consciousness, and then you might have a different pastor preaching it from a different layer of consciousness. And one is all about that sin and brimstone and hell, and just it's very scary. And then you have someone else that is teaching it all about compassion and about unity and connection. And so I'm sure all of us have thought about this at one point or another, that there's so many damn confusing messages, even from one source on our planet. And so how does that even function? And the truth is, all of these realities are accurate to the people who are living these realities, but they're just coming at it from different layers of consciousness. And please, before I get into this, please note that one is not better than the other. You know, because anytime I teach that, all of a sudden people look to their spouse or their family member or their friend, they're just like, well, you're in the mundane. It's like, no, you're not here to judge them. You know, we then start to size people up in what layer they're in. And please, please, please do not do that. This is just to help you on your own path, understanding if you're falling into ego and duality, or you're rising up through it. And so the 5 layers, I'll just do a quick overview. The 5 layers, you have mundane, you have collective, transcendent, galactic, and cosmic. And for those of you who have little handouts, I have them written here. So the mundane consciousness, the mundane and collective, I'd say probably about 90% of the planet exists within. And that's where we really fall into the trap of the ego. We fall into the trap of duality. We fall into the trap of morality, where we're constantly sizing up life. Right, wrong, good, bad. We get so focused on our just little bubble that it's really hard for us to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And I feel like everyone's heard that saying before, oh, just put yourself in other people's shoes. Well, anytime you're in judgment, you're not doing that. So I bet every single one of you, most people in this room, feel like you're good at putting yourself in other people's shoes because we're taught that from such a young age. But the irony is that the moment we start to judge others, we're not in their shoes at all. And because when we put ourselves in other people's shoes, it develops compassion, it develops forgiveness, it develops peace. And so that's just kind of a fun little thing to point out, where you might pride yourself and be like, I understand people really well. But if you're following that up with a lot of judgments and you're not at peace with the situation at hand, that just kind of shows that you got some work to do, sweetie. So let's take a breath. So again, the mundane consciousness it's kind of the word mundane. It's not a negative or bad word. It just means we're really just so focused on what's in front of us and what's around us. Maybe it's someone who is just so focused on their direct family. And these might be individuals who may not necessarily belong to an expanded community or expanded religion or political group. They're just so focused on what is right here, right now, and just trying to do what they can. And you could be happy, let me be very clear, you could be happy in any of these layers. It's just all about the consciousness, not so much about the vibration. The collective, when you fall into the collective, that's when you start to look around. You start to say, I want to share what I got with others. And this is where you start to get political groups and you get religious groups. And it's entities that have large numbers and they're trying to influence the world for better. But unfortunately, when you think you're right and other people are wrong and you need to influence them to help them, you're falling into judgment again, aren't you? You're falling into conflict, you're falling into separation. So if you're trying to help other people create peace when you yourself may not actually have inner peace, and you just think if all the colors were just red, or all the colors were blue, or if all the colors were just, if everyone was just green like me, then we would all get along. That mindset that just kind of blurs out diversity is very much a collective thought pattern, and it keeps people trapped in suffering. And then you have the transcendent. Moving on to the transcendent is when you become the black sheep, the rainbow sheep, the alien sheep. You were part of a group and then you get thrown out because you no longer follow the tradition, you no longer follow the customs, and it's just, you start to see the hypocrisy of it. I always tell people I was a black, rainbow, etheric, and alien sheep. I never belonged to any type of group. And so what's beautiful in that is you get spit out of it, but once you're outside of it, you start to see the cracks, you see the hypocrisy, and it's this very illuminating awareness. But unfortunately, the challenge, and a lot of people, many of us in this room are probably in the transcendent, is we're still trying to figure out this whole peace thing. You see the hypocrisy, but you're still struggling with your own internal judgments and making peace with it. And I always tell people, in the mundane and the collective, it's much more rooted because there's traditions and there's that community feel. And as long as you're following with it, you feel very safe and secure and you're with your place in the world. The transcendent, it's like the rug is just pulled out from under you and you're just trying to get by. So a lot of people who kind of wake up to the realization that there's so many more belief systems, so much more reality out there than what they were just raised to believe, it's this rug being pulled out from under you feeling. And it's really hard to get your roots grounded back into the present moment. And so there's a lot of neurosis and healing that occurs in the transcendent, because you might start to realize, holy shit, I've been the one creating my pain for all of my life. Yes, these awful things have happened to me, but I recognize that I'm the one that keeps going back to the addiction. I'm the one that keeps going back to the abusive relationships. I'm the one. And that's a lot of weight to bear. While in the first two layers of consciousness, you just blame other people for your problems. And so the transcendent, it can be a very neurotic place to be, just because you're trying to figure things out, and it takes time. And then you go into the galactic layer of consciousness. And this is when you really start to solidify and make peace with yourself. And you understand the illusion of duality. You understand the illusion of the ego. And you're not triggered by life anymore. You're not triggered by other people anymore. You've healed your core wounds. And so deeper into this layer is where you have the bodhisattvas and the ascended masters like Jesus and Buddha and all those folks. And I would even put Thich Nhat Hanh there. We definitely have modern bodhisattvas living with us today. And these are individuals that are just able to hold space for other people. They've really released their attachment to identity and self, and they're able to just show up and be active participants in the world without constantly being swayed by their emotions or swayed by the external conflicts. Because if you're constantly being swayed by your emotions or other people's emotions or situations of the world, again, that's not peace. And really, you can't do much help for the world if you're constantly up, down, all around. So we really want to bring that balance in. And then the cosmic consciousness, the very last, that's really not something we can fully experience. You might want to call that God, the universe, whatever. I always like to say that's the perfect analogy of the burning bush. If you look at the burning bush, you go blinded because you just can't handle the immensity of it. And so the cosmic consciousness is what holds all of it together. And so each layer expands out. So you have the mundane in here, then you have the collective, yada, 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 and then you have the cosmic holding it all together. And fun story about all this is that many of us may actually go through these layers throughout the day. So sometimes we might be in the mundane, we might transition into transcendent, and then we're just kind of going up and down all around. And so that's why it's also important not to judge anyone for this, because we're constantly changing in and out of them. And then the funny thing is, once you get into judgment, if you were in the transcendent, then you just dropped down back into the mundane and the collective. And so you have to really work on maintaining that equilibrium for yourself. And so in the book, this was thanks to actually my husband, Andrew. He was saying, wouldn't it be helpful in the mastery of thought and the file exchange practice if I actually used sentences that really started out dense and then expanded them through each of the layers to help students understand? So thank you, Andrew. And that's what I have written down here for y'all. And so let's go ahead and read each of the sentences if you have a handout. And I'm just going to show you the quality of thinking that occurs depending on which layer of consciousness you are residing in. So if you're in the mundane, you're probably going to say something along the lines of, day in and day out, people continue to disappoint me. And then I blame people for disappointing me. It's their fault. Who's ever thought that before? We're just like, if they just would have behaved, you know, if they would have just done X, Y, and Z, you know, fuck them. You know, I know you think it, you know, and that's okay. We're here. This is a safe space. You can let it out. And so that's really the mundane. You could feel the vibration of that sentence. It's there's no personal responsibility there, and it's really just directing that emotion towards someone else for disappointing us. And then you get into the collective. And again, this is where people start to kind of wake up a little bit, and they're just like, you know what, people disappoint me sometimes, but I quickly forgive them. So yeah, you might be a forgiving person, but I always tell folks, forgiveness is such an ego trip. I'm not a fan of forgiveness. Who's ever had someone hold forgiveness over your head? You know, they're just like, you know what, you know, I just need, you know, once I forgive you, then we can come back to you. I just need time. It's like, no, there's only the present moment. So if you really want to rectify this relationship, then let's talk about this rather than you hold all the power in this relationship. And then once you forgive me, then we can come back into alignment. That is not healthy at all. And that is how often people use forgiveness. And so that's the whole thing. It's like, well, you hurt me and then I'm going to work on, then I'll forgive you. Again, if you're in an abusive situation, that's a whole other type of thing. That's called healthy boundaries. You want to let that shit go. You want to forgive for your own self. But at the same time, if you're just in a regular relationship with someone, it's really not that big of a deal. And it's just, you know, we get pissed off at the silliest things, don't we? And then we are probably in friends and we have family members that get pissed off at the silliest things. And it could just be a simple disagreement. And so this is the part where you're going to notice that there's that whole forgiveness power trip thing going on in the collective. In the mundane, they just won't even, they're just like, done. I'm not even going to bring it up. And so also it might say, when I feel disappointment, I try to remember that everyone is doing the best they can with what they know. So that still shows that we're still being triggered by life and we still feel offended by people, but we're working on it. We're recognizing that everyone really is doing the best they can with what they know. So again, that's just kind of raising it up a little bit more. And then you get into the transcendent, which is, it's my own expectations that create my disappointment. And I understand that no one has the power to disappoint me unless I give them that power. Different, isn't it? It's my own expectations that create my disappointment versus day in and day out, people continue to disappoint me. Very big difference in vibration there between the two sentences. And then you follow that up with, my disappointment in others is often a mirror of the disappointment I feel in myself. Here's a fun fact. When you have inner peace, people don't disappoint you anymore. It just doesn't happen because you're not viewing life in that way. You're not viewing life in that way. And I'll explain more in a little bit. But I love that. My disappointment in others is often a mirror of the disappointment I feel myself. Have you ever noticed that the worse you feel, the more disappointed you feel by other people? When you're actually feeling in a rough mood, it's funny how thoughts just compact and compound upon themselves. And you can just turn on the news and look at the world and you're just like, oh God. And then you just start to feel the negativity increase. But if you start off and you're feeling great a certain day and someone comes along and maybe they're late for something and then just something happens, you're kind of like, oh, no problem. You know, it's kind of like you're a duck and the water just rolls off of your back. But if you're already in a rough mood that day and someone's 30 minutes late, do you think you're going to handle it the same way if you're in a great mood that day? You know, so that's the funny thing about vibration and consciousness and just how we're absorbing information from the world is that it has a lot less to do with the circumstances themselves, and it has a lot more to do with our own layer of consciousness and where we're residing in that moment and how we're going to respond to the situations of the world. And then you move on to the galactic consciousness. And then you're going to say something like this. I am superbly grateful for any spontaneous feelings of disappointment that arise within me, for it shows me areas of my life that I have yet to make peace with. And so you start to shift away from blame and you start to shift into gratitude. And I always share this story. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard it before. But when Andrew and I got married, I'm just like, I can't wait for our first argument. I can't wait to feel anger, just because that's going to be a wonderful opportunity to root out if there's any unresolved emotions that we're bringing into this marriage. And so anytime there's conflict in my life, I view it as a beautiful opportunity to smooth out, iron out any communication kinks or core wounds that we may have brought into the relationship. Well, we haven't had an argument yet. I don't think we ever will, actually, just because we live and practice this every single day. But there's definitely been times where we've had some friction, and there's like a little brush up and a little like, I don't feel understood in this situation. Now, because I'm normally in the transcendent or galactic, I will simply say, I don't feel understood in this situation, rather than, you don't understand me. Who's done that before? Who's yelled, you don't understand me, to someone? That is not a helpful thing to say. Because it's not like that's going to just spark them and be like, oh my gosh, you are so right. No, it makes them more on the offense or defense, versus saying, taking responsibility and just say, I don't feel understood in this moment. Can we work on clarity? Let me follow up with another question, or maybe let me try and take greater time to explain what I'm feeling in this moment. So you see how it shifts our vocabulary depending on the layer of consciousness that you're residing in. And so then we have, I am beyond grateful for every interaction I have. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Who's ever felt that before? I am beyond grateful for every interaction I have. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And that is just a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful mindset to adopt. And that would actually be a wonderful thing to write down on a mirror. Just read it every single day. You may not feel it yet, but if you write it on a mirror, it's going to slowly incept your mind. You're going to brainwash yourself to really start to understand that it is important to feel grateful for every interaction, because all of this thing that's happening, every interaction we're having, is called freaking life, people, and it's a miracle. So even when you're having an awful day, it's still a miracle that we're alive and that we're here. Thich Nhat Hanh teaches that, in the Bible and other mystical texts, there's always these like big mystical miracles that happen. And, we'll say like Jesus walking on water, or the Buddha levitating, just any type of thing that you might have in your mind of these masters being able to do these like miraculous things. And he says those are small miracles. The big miracle is that life exists on this rock floating in space. And when you really think about it, like, what type of all these different components had to come together to make life possible here? And when we remember that, it humbles us. And that's the miracle that we're constantly taking for granted when we're constantly chasing these supernatural miracles that to convince ourselves and convince other people in certain belief systems, which isn't really helpful, because really the number one thing that we really want to be focusing on each and every day is just to be alive in the moment and to enjoy it, even when it's a rough day, if that makes sense. There can always be beauty found in every moment. And so last week we gave such a beautiful sermon and interaction all about the beauty of death and the wisdom that death teaches us, and that the moment a death occurs, it instantly makes you feel grateful for life. It reminds you of the fleetingness and the impermanence, and it brings us back into awareness. But then we forget a couple weeks later, and then we go back to bitching about the silliest things, right? And I'll get back to that. And then finally, we have the cosmic. And the cosmic is all is well, and all is most beautifully well. Many of you hear me say that at the beginning when we ground ourselves into the moment, where I always conclude it with all is well, and all is most deliciously well. And that is really a true mindset. If you fully practice this whole 5-layer bit and you practice the 9 living peace codes, you do start to recognize that no matter what is happening in your life or on the planet, there is an all is wellness around it. Even amidst tragedy, there is still a wellness around it, because people are still moving forward and they're still healing and they're still being there for one another. And so last night I actually watched a TED Talk, which really beautifully captures this. Speaking of capture, it was this woman, South Korean woman, who was captured and held prisoner for about over a year by North Korea. And she was a journalist, and she was at the border, and she was filming some things, because this was an area where people escaped from North Korea to cross over and to, find freedom. And so she was captured they were filming, and then they saw these two guards approaching them. They started running, and they just say, if we just get to the Chinese border and Chinese soil, we'll be safe. But her friend fell, and so she went back to help her friend up, and before they knew it, they were surrounded. But what was interesting is that, in South Korea, just as in North Korea, they're each fed propaganda that the other one's the enemy. And so she used to watch even these childhood shows, these kids shows, and how it would depict the evil North and the dictator and all these things, and how even just as children, you're being indoctrinated into believing that they're the enemy. But what she was found is that even how the guards held her captive, and there was a lot of torturous things that she had to go through. But she said what she remembers from the whole experience is that when a guard gave her a boiled egg, just for no reason other than just mere kindness and just saying, eat this, it'll help you last longer. And then there was this other moment where these female guards brought her in and were giggling, and they were just saying, what is dating like in the United States? And so there's that humanity that exists, and there's so many things that we're still connected on, such as dating, such as relationships. And so even in North Korea, that still is the thing, and people are still thinking about that. And it's just so fascinating that she said that's what she remembers. And even when she was leaving, the older female guard came in, and she said, I hope you're able to go back to your family, because she recognized how hard it was for this woman to be separated from her family for a whole year. And that guard herself could not imagine being separated from her family for the whole year. And they recognized that they were both brought up on different shows that depicted the other side as evil and the enemy, when really they were just put in these circumstances and they had these belief systems, but there was still a lot that they could connect on a human level. And so that was the beautiful thing, and the TED Talk was about, is that what she walked away from that experience with was not the torture, but rather the random acts of kindness that she was seeing, and the random acts of connection that she was seeing. And that when you view someone as the enemy, they do become the enemy, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And so I just love that in that moment, she was transcending, going from the mundane consciousness. And because she was held captive, it actually forced her to rise up through the layers of consciousness and then transcend her limiting belief that she was always raised with. And then it helped her have a deep, deep, deep compassion for these other individuals who are also trapped within their own belief systems and trapped in the country. And so I just thought that was just a really, really powerful story that helps us transcend our own limitations that we project upon ourselves because of our environment that we're often raised up in. Let's take a breath. On that note, I'm going to share a short story from Thich Nhat Hanh, who also went through something very similar. And so this is called The Last Sack of Rice. In 1946, during the French Indochina War, I was a novice monk in central Vietnam. At that time, the city Hue was occupied by the French army. One day, 2 French soldiers arrived at our temple. While one stayed in the jeep outside the temple gate, the other came in carrying a gun and demanded all of our rice. We had only 1 sack of rice for all the monks, and he wanted to take it away. The soldier was young and not yet 20, and very hungry. He looked pale and thin, as if he had malaria, which I also had at the time. I had to obey his order to carry our heavy bag of rice to the jeep. It was a long distance, and as I staggered under the bag's precious weight, anger and unhappiness rose up in me. They were taking what little rice we had, leaving our community without any food. As I walked back into the temple, I was crying. Only later did I learn that one of the elder monks had secretly buried a large container of rice on the temple grounds deep in the earth. Many times over the years, I've meditated on this French soldier. I had seen that, still in his teens, he had to leave his parents, brothers, sisters, and friends to travel across the world to Vietnam, where he was faced with the horrors of killing my countrymen or being killed himself. I have often wondered whether the soldier survived the war and was able to return home to his parents. It is very likely that he did not survive. The French Indochina War lasted many years, ending only with the French defeat in 1954. After looking deeply, I came to realize that the Vietnamese were not the only victims of the war. The French soldiers were victims as well. With this insight, I no longer had any anger toward the young soldier. Instead, compassion for him rose within me, and I only wished him wellness. I did not know the soldier's name, and he did not know mine, but when we met, we were already enemies. He came and was prepared to kill me for our food, and I had to comply in order to protect myself and my fellow monks. And yet the two of us were not by nature enemies. Under different circumstances, we could have become close friends, maybe even loving one another as brothers. It was the war that separated us and brought violence between us. This is the nature of war. It turns us into enemies. People who have never met kill each other out of fear. War creates so much suffering. Children become orphans. Entire cities and villages are destroyed. All who suffer in such conflicts are victims. Coming from a background of such enormous devastation and suffering, and having experienced the French Indochina and Vietnam wars, I have a deep aspiration to prevent war from ever happening again. It is my prayer that nations will no longer send their young people to fight each other, not even in the name of peace. I do not accept the concept of war for peace, nor for a just war, in the same way that I cannot accept the concepts of justified slavery, justified hatred, or justified racism. During the wars in Vietnam, my friends and I declared ourselves neutral. We took no sides and had no enemies, North or South, French, American, or Vietnamese. We were all neutral. Take a breath. And so as you can see, once again, started out in the mundane consciousness, collective consciousness, and he was able to transmute it all the way into the galactic layer of consciousness, recognizing the separation of the illusory separation that was created during wartime between people who often could have just most likely been friends and even brothers. And so that is Thich Nhat Hanh's approach, and going through 2 wars himself really led him into this becoming the father of mindfulness. And what's fascinating, 30 years later, he winds up in France. And that's where Plum Village exists today, one of the #1 largest leading monasteries in the West. And so it's so fascinating that it was started with the French killing his countrymen, and then he ends up years later being welcomed into France after being exiled from Vietnam because he was preaching peace, because he would not take a side, because he would not side with his own country with the war. And so this is the fascinating thing, that all of us can relate to this even here right now in America, because there is so much division going on. And there's so much division going on with even other countries and the border and all these things going on. And a lot of times it's very, 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 let me say that again, very easy to just go along with what is being spoken to us and make us feel fear, to make us feel a little bit of aggression, to make us feel, yes, we need to protect ourselves and we need to do all of these things, but it's really important. I'm not saying what to do here, but the only thing I'm just recommending all of us do is just take a step back and reflect on these couple of stories and ask ourselves, are we open to the suffering of the world? Or are we limiting ourselves to our own small little family unit and saying, I just want my own family to be safe and secure? Because if you're always coming at it from that point, and there's always going to be enemies for the rest of your life. Even your own family might be enemies, right? The family members that are not in alignment, and then you're just like, we're just gonna be over here and keep to our own little safety net. So it's funny that we can see that happening on a micro level in our own very communities, in our own homes, and we can see that happening on a macro level to where we become very closed off from the rest of the world and other people's suffering. And so here's my invitation for all of you, is to make sure that you recognize that every time you have a judgment against someone else, whether it's someone you know or a group of people, you just completely blocked off all further understanding and compassion. Compassion is the thing that dissolves the hardening of our heart that occurs. And here's one more thing I want to share. I didn't get a chance to say it last Sunday because it was quite an intense sermon and it went on quite a long time. But I wanted to share, which I'll share today, is that kindness is universal and something very easy to do. All of us have seen kindness and all of us have enacted kindness. But isn't it funny? Isn't it funny that it's the first thing that goes out the door the moment we get triggered, right? Is peace rare, or is kindness rare? Not really. Is kindness hard to do? Absolutely not. But what's fascinating is that the moment we get triggered, we drop into the mundane consciousness, we need to protect ourselves, we close off our heart, And all of a sudden we become defensive. And in that defensiveness, the bridges of communication just completely get obliterated. I see this happening in marriages all the time. I see this happening in friendships, relationships, communities, even just countries conversing with themselves. It is so fascinating how quickly the bridge of communication evaporates the moment that we just let kindness go out the window. And it always comes from a place of needing to protect ourselves. Because you walk outside and someone starts shouting at you, you feel like you need to protect yourself, right? It's like, this is my little peace bubble. I came on a Sunday and I felt great and I was leaving and you just start shouting at me. How dare you? Now the rest of my day is fucked up. You know, that just put me in a sour mood. Damn it. But really, that's just one interaction that was happening. You don't have to have the rest of your day be negative, but because you're resisting that negativity happening on the planet, you're resisting it with your mind, and then it puts you in a bad mood. You put yourself in the bad mood. But really, that whole situation happening outside was just someone that was not in alignment, calling out for love, calling out for kindness, that we could have had compassion for. Yes, there's moments where we have to protect ourselves and we have healthy boundaries and we remove ourselves from a situation. But when you have healthy boundaries, it doesn't mean you're closing off your heart and being filled with judgment. I have plenty of healthy boundaries, but in my mind, I'm not blaming the other person. I'm not having anger towards the other person. It's just, this is my own little life and I'm going to do what I do. And if I don't have healthy boundaries, I'll be exhausted 24/7. I couldn't be here for you guys. But at the same time, those healthy boundaries are not wrapped up into judgment. So if you have a pen, write that down. Healthy boundaries and then an equal sign with a slash through it, judgment. They are not one in the same. A lot of people use judgment to place their healthy boundaries, but that's not the case. We're going to use peace to place our healthy boundaries so that we can then give peace more, if that makes sense. Just as Thich Nhat Hanh had a very healthy boundary of not choosing sides. He had a very healthy boundary of not hating the so-called enemy. He had a very healthy boundary, etc., etc., etc. His boundary was not falling into the judgment or the propaganda. And it led to the Vietnamese government placing a boundary against him and exiling him. But even with that, being kicked out of his own home country, he still had his own healthy boundary of not hating them, not viewing them as wrong. Because if you view someone as wrong, guess what happens? You instantly create judgment. You instantly shut the communication channels down. Instead, he just accepted that this is the fact. I'm going to have compassion for it. It's very painful within myself, but I'm going to move forward and continue practicing kindness with everything, every fiber of my being. And so all of you, your homework this week, I invite you, next time you feel triggered in any situation, drop into loving kindness, no matter how hard it is. Drop into loving kindness. Let go of speaking with the tone. That's one of the easiest things to start with. Every single one of us, anytime we're stressed, your tone of your voice changes a little bit, doesn't it? Soften it, soften it, soften it. I think it's been about 2 years since I've really had a tone, because there was this one moment where I just said, I never want to speak in a tone again. You know, I always want to come from a place of, and when I say tone, I'm meaning, you know, the friction tone. We always have a different tone, but I always want to speak with compassion in my voice. And when I made that vow, guess what? It became so much easier to keep the vow versus, you know what, I'm just going to do what I can, you know, just kind of casually, lackadaisically not speak in a tone. No, I'm never going to do it again. And guess what? Anytime I notice a tone starting to come up a little bit, I remember that vow and then it goes back down because I made that commitment to not only myself, but other people. Does that make sense? So if you want to start with a very simple practice, recognize the tones that you have with different people. Do you speak differently to different people? Or are you always the same with a loving kindness voice? And that is something that we can all work on together to create more peace, not only in our communities, but also our town here and then our country as a whole. Isn't that beautiful? I'm going to leave you with one little story, quick story, personal that just happened to me. So a couple days ago, right here in the corner in front of the church right there, there was a protest, or as I like to call it, a demonstration that was just people coming together in solidarity to speak out or show out against the children being put into cages on our border right now. And so I went over there and I interacted. What was beautiful is that the pastor of that church was there. right there as well. And so I met him a couple times before, but we got to connect. And I'm like, although technically I guess you could say I'm Buddhist, but really I'm more Dunisha. But when I'm meeting other people, I'll present more of the Buddhist front because it's something they can understand. But here I'm surrounded by Christians. And some of them don't get me. And but what was beautiful in that moment, and that church has already just expressed their support of us, and if there's anything that we need. You know, I thought back to Thich Nhat Hanh coming together with Martin Luther King Jr. and how to create peace, it took all religions working together. And so many people who come to our center are people who have been burned by religion. It's kind of our niche market. A lot of people come here because they've been burned by religion and they don't like it. And so they often will be very judgmental towards the religion that they came from or just religion as a whole. And unfortunately for you guys, I invite you not to do that. I invite you to challenge yourself. And so had I had a closed off heart, and I would, because I've been burned many times by religion, especially the Judeo-Christian religions. Had I had a closed heart, I may not have gone over there and interacted and made a bridge of communication. And I asked the pastor, and I said, you know, I would love to have an interfaith dialogue at some point. And maybe we can put together either just you and I, or if there's any other pastors in this town, to bring together a conversation of understanding between the various belief systems that are all taking up residence here in our beautiful little town. And he was very much on board with that. I don't know when that will occur, but that was a bridge of communication that could only occur if I let go of my own identity of being a gay man that has been majorly abused by people who are from Christian faith. You know, calling me an abomination, calling me a faggot, calling me sin, that I'm a disgrace. And putting that down. Same thing with being Buddhist in a conservative small town in America. You know, just the other day, two young men drove by and I didn't catch fully what they said, but they were looking directly at me as I was walking in, and I could definitely get the vibe that they were saying something obscene to me. And that's not the first time that has happened. And so me being able to put that down and still bridge communication, that is what this work is about. And every single one of you, I know many of you in this room have your own prejudices, have your own biases. You're very kind people, all of you, truly. You're very kind people. But the areas of where you have been burned before, that is where we need to start applying some ice. Sure. That's where we need to start applying some ice and healing that wound so that we can open up the conversation. Because think about it, it's the interfaith dialogues that will lead to greater understanding, because so many of us, even on Facebook, you unfollow the people that disagree with you. We're always just kind of putting ourselves in our own bubbles, and then we're not even hearing the suffering or the messages that other people are expressing. Many people who are one political group only watch one or two news networks. People who are other group watch a different news network. Different messages. They're not hearing each other's sides of the suffering. And so that is the gap that we're wanting to start to unify on this planet. And when we can do that, not only in our homes, but in our communities, and then as a nation, you're going to see so much more peace coming together. And we're going to be able to feel joy much more often on a daily basis, rather than fear, rather than upset, rather than frustration, rather than eye rolling, etc. Let's take a breath. So I don't know if I got through all my notes, but I feel like that's a great place to conclude on. Let's take one more breath. We can ask questions after. One more breath. Dropping into the moment. And as always, I want to thank all of everyone present with us today. We have a full house, which is pretty cool, every seat filled. And then for those of you at home who listened to the entirety of this sermon, good for you. That is really wonderful. And there's links below if you're able to become a Patreon support. Even just $1, $2, $3, $5 a month really helps us. And then also if you want to give anything more, you can just send us a PayPal donation. Again, that helps us tremendously. A lot of time goes on behind the scenes, putting out newsletters, uploading these videos, putting these sermons together, and so all of the support helps. And for anyone who wants to get deeper into the teachings, I'm always available for training and coaching. Thank you all. See you next week. Blessed be.